So it's Dyspraxia Awareness Week, so I decided to make a video about dyspraxia. So observe my various trains of thoughts on this subject. As you may be aware, I have a diagnosis of dyspraxia, so obviously I have a personal investment in this subject. So let's begin. And we're going to begin with dyspraxia and intelligence. Does dyspraxia affect intelligence? This is a good question. Can you have an IQ of Neil deGrasse and have dyspraxia? Can you have an IQ of Oscar Wilde and have dyspraxia? Could you have an IQ of Einstein and have dyspraxia? Again, good questions. So let's explore this. So to answer this fully, it's important to understand what is intelligence. What is intelligence? This word is used a lot, but not many people explore what it actually means. So let's break it down into 3 levels. Level 1. So intelligence is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills. Level 2. Now this is slightly more complicated. So there are 9 types of intelligence. This is spatial, naturalistic, musical, logical, mathematical, existential, interpersonal, body kinesthetic, linguistic, and intrapersonal. Okay, that's a mouthful. So let's give some context to this. So Obama, the former president, has great linguistic intelligence because he is good with words. Jay-Z has great linguistic intelligence because, again, he is good with words. And Albert Camus would have great existential intelligence. You get the picture. So now let's move to level 3. I would argue, and I think there's a convincing argument here, that there is intelligence in specific fields. Let's give some examples. Einstein clearly would have great scientific intelligence. Evander Holyfield would have great boxing intelligence. Gary Kasparov would have great chess intelligence. So clearly, to conclude this part, you can have a high IQ and have dyspraxia. For example, you can have dyspraxia and have great existential intelligence. You could have dyspraxia and have great mathematical intelligence. You could have dyspraxia and have great boxing intelligence, great tennis intelligence. I'm guessing you're getting the picture. So yes, you can have a high IQ, you can be very intelligent, and you can have dyspraxia, because dyspraxia does not directly affect intelligence. So let's move on to the next part of this. And the next question is, how many people have dyspraxia? So to me, this is another interesting question. So the following numbers are according to the Dyspraxia Foundation. So up to 10% apparently have dyspraxia, but 2% of the 10% are severely affected. So let's try and give this some context, and let's give 2 examples. So let's take a workplace, and in the workplace we have 400 workers. So that would mean, under the template that I've just described, 10% would have dyspraxia. So that means 40 would have dyspraxia out of the 400, and 8 out of the 400 would have dyspraxia but also be severely affected by it. Now let's take an educational establishment which has, let's say, 1,000 students. Now again, under the template that we've explained, that would mean 100 people would be affected by dyspraxia, 100 out of 1,000, but 20 would be severely affected by dyspraxia. There's some interesting questions here that immediately come to mind. When we use the terminology severely affected, what does that mean? So that's definitely something to explore. What does severely affected mean? But 10% is a large number, and when we're in institutions, whether they're educational institutions or workplace institutions, the likelihood is that there will be people that will be neurodiverse, i.e. will have conditions such as dyspraxia. So now let's move on to the next section, and this is dyspraxia in education. And to me, the question here would be, how does someone with dyspraxia do well in the educational system? Now, this is just my perspective, so again, check my train of thought. And this is hindsight bias at its finest, because this is what I would do now as opposed what I did then. And with regards to my experience in academia, I have a degree, 2 postgraduate degrees, and hopefully I'm currently finishing my master's while doing a full-time job. So I'm going to lay this out in 3 points. So the first point is understand your learning style. Now, there are 7 learning styles, but for convenience, we're going to break it down to 4. So this is visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and read and write. Now, as usual, let's give this some proper context. Let's give 3 examples. So Jack likes to read articles. This increases his understanding. Therefore, Jack has a read and write style. Laura likes to listen to things auditory. She often listens to podcasts. She has an auditory learning style. Tom, now he watches YouTube. This increases his understanding. So Tom has a visual learning style. So hopefully this enables you to understand in context the different type of learning styles. So when you understand your learning style, you increase your ability to do better in the education system. And this would answer the question, why understand your learning style? And to me, I would say, think of the car analogy. If I need to get from A to B, I need to know where B is so that I can put that into Google Maps. And Google Maps gives me that awareness. It gives me that understanding. So knowing your learning style is having that awareness. It's having that understanding of where you need to go. And think of it like this as well. Understanding your strengths means that you can build on your strengths. And also understanding your weaknesses means that you can build on your weaknesses. So now let's move on to point 2. And point 2 is read more. So the book that really helped me was How to Win Friends and Influence People. Now, why was this book important, and why is reading important? Well, let's deal with the first element of that question. Why is this book important? Well, I would argue that it's important as human beings to build effective relationships with other human beings. This is crucial. You may disagree with that premise, but let's explore this in the educational context. So in your degree, or master's degree or PhD, you will need to build good relationships with your course tutor and other teachers. You will need to develop positive relationship with colleagues. If you live in student halls, you will need to develop good relationships with your housemates. And this book could potentially help you do that. So to me, books are potential resources, because reading books by intelligent people will give you greater awareness, and this will make you more interesting, and it will also enable you to have a greater toolkit. So let's move on to point 3, and point 3 would be utilize the resources available. So if you have a formal diagnosis of dyspraxia, see what help the universities offer. You may be able to get a tutor, and you may be able to get some equipment that is either fully or partially funded. Now remember, the succession of human evolution is based on using resources effectively. For example, human beings used fire as a resource to see other dangerous animals, and we used fire to cook food. We also used the resource of effective communication to hunt in groups. So utilizing resources has historically been such an important part of human development. So to relay this back to the university context, if you have the resource of getting a tutor, if you have the resource of getting some equipment, even fully or partially funded, utilize that resource and understand that utilizing these resources will enable you to become the best version of you. Okay, so I feel like I've been rambling a bit, so let's go to the next section or the next question. And this is, who can officially diagnose dyspraxia? And I'm going to preface this with a personal story. So let me tell you this story. So when I went to university to do my first degree, I was referred to what I believe was the student support department. And from there, they arranged an assessment with an educational psychologist. And when I met the educational psychologist, I had what was an assessment, an interview, and we had a sequence of tests, and then he put together a report. And in that report, he came to the conclusion or diagnosis that I had dyspraxia. Now, before that time, I had only heard of dyslexia. I had no idea what dyspraxia was. So what I would say, based on this story, is that if you suspect you have dyspraxia, and if you have these suspicions, you may want to consider trying to get an official diagnosis. And that leads to answering the question, who can officially diagnose dyspraxia? Now, based on my research, the following are the professionals that can diagnose dyspraxia. So this is in no particular order. So you've got a pediatrician, a pediatric occupational therapist, a pediatric physiotherapist, a clinical psychologist, and an educational psychologist. So these are the professionals that can officially diagnose dyspraxia. So let's move on to the next bit, and this is going to be just a short section, and that is dyspraxia and diet. I've talked about this before. This is purely a personal opinion. So the premise here is that dyspraxia can affect memory and dyspraxia can affect concentration. So for me, it seems quite logical to use diet to try and help with my concentration and memory issues. Now, disclaimer, I am not someone who has a formal qualification in, I'm not a dietitian basically. So bear that in mind for what I tell you next. So to me, coffee sharpens concentration, so I often use coffee to help with my performance. Let's put this in context. So Jack is unable to study at high levels unless he has his cup of coffee. Blueberries allegedly improve memory. So historically I used to have a smoothie with blueberries, and the reason for that was to help with my memory issues that are associated with dyspraxia. So again, let's put that in context. Laura incorporates blueberries in her diet because this helps with her memory, which is important because she has her final year exams. So when we talk about dyspraxia and diet, effectively we're looking at diet as a resource that can help with the secondary issues of dyspraxia. And that leads into the next part of the discussion, which is, what is dyspraxia? So John asks Laura, what is dyspraxia in one sentence? And he states, dyspraxia is a developmental coordination disorder. So that's dyspraxia in one sentence, but it doesn't tell the full story. So let's just give a little bit more context. So with dyspraxia, which is a developmental coordination disorder, there is also additional things that can be affected with dyspraxia, and that can be your gross motor, your fine motor, your concentration, your communication, your thought process, and your eye movements. And this is all according to the Dyspraxia Foundation website. But let's give this a bit of context. So people with dyspraxia, they may struggle riding a bike, they may struggle driving a car, they may struggle focusing in class or at work, and they may have coordination or organizational issues. So for example, Jack may struggle processing his thoughts, Laura may struggle with concentration in the classroom, and Jane may struggle with her communication, etc. So these are all the potential barriers of dyspraxia. So when I define dyspraxia, I define it in two phases. Phase 1, dyspraxia is a developmental coordination disorder. And phase 2, dyspraxia has secondary issues such as gross motor, fine motor, concentration, communication, thought process, eye movements, etc. So let me quickly give an example of gross motor and fine motor. So Tom struggles with walking, and Sarah, she struggles with holding a knife and fork when she's eating. So these are some quick examples of gross motor and fine motor respectively. And with that being said, let's lead to our next question, which is, well, before we get to our next section, this actually inspired some other questions, which is, what causes dyspraxia and is there a cure for dyspraxia? And I think this is an interesting question. And at the time of writing, there is no dyspraxia gene, and the causes are not understood. Now, this can lead to some other interesting queries, like how much money is being invested in answering this question. So, at the time of writing, we don't understand the causes. Like I said, there's no dyspraxia gene. And when it comes to answering, is there a cure for dyspraxia? At the moment, the answer is no. So that means, you can't take any medication or utilize any diet to cure dyspraxia. So dyspraxia is a permanent condition. It is a lifelong condition. So this leads to our last and final section, which is dyspraxia and shopping lists. So I made a video years ago about dyspraxia and shopping lists. And the premise to this video is important because it was based on the premise that dyspraxia affects memory and it affects concentration. And those two elements can hinder someone shopping effectively. Now, when you add the psychology of the shopping mall, which is for the consumer to buy more, you have a potential issue with shopping if you don't have a shopping list. Therefore, a shopping list is crucial and effective to minimize the barriers of dyspraxia. So for me, this would mean that, when you go shopping, it's important to have either a written list. This could be a physically written list, or it may be a list that you've put on your phone. But this is particularly important if you have dyspraxia, because if you don't have a shopping list, you're likely to buy things that you don't need or don't want, not actually buy the things that you actually need. So that for me is the conclusion to Dyspraxia Conversations. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that this is beneficial for raising awareness with regards to dyspraxia.